Hello and welcome. This video brings you one in our series of Norwich Society history talks. It is one of two talks that we had this season that relates to the strangers in Norwich and East Anglia. The first was by the local historian and writer Frank Mears, who told us about the records referring to the strangers that can be found in the Norfolk County archives. This is the second presentation. It is by the novelist Jeni Neill, and she tells us how she used these records to create her historical novel, The Devil's Die. This talk is of interest to historians because she recreates the Norwich of the strangers in the 16th century and talks about the old legend of Black Shuck. But it will also be of interest to aspiring writers as she talks about how she got her book published and into the shops. So a warm welcome to Jeni.
Hello, thanks for listening and watching my talk on Finding the Devil in the Die. I'm Jeni Neill and I self-published my debut novel called The Devil's Die about 3 years ago. It's set in East Anglia, and I find that when I give these talks to local libraries and societies, the feedback I get is very much that not only readers of historical fiction enjoy the talk, but also readers of contemporary fiction, because there are actually quite a lot of the issues in the story that we face in today's society as well. Also those that are either thinking that they'd like one day to write a book or are maybe in the process of writing seem to enjoy the fact that my talk kind of looks at the journey from beginning to the end project, and I talk about the different stages of publishing the novel. So without further ado, I'll kind of go into my talk for you. Just to give you a little bit of background on who I am and when I started writing. This is a painting by my father, John Hall, and he called it Fen Road. And it's a huge oil painting. It's actually darker than we've managed to kind of lighten it for the purposes of print. But it was very dominant, and it was in every house that we lived in, because I think my dad painted it when I was about 2 years old. And to me, it really summarises everything that I hated about the landscape that I was growing up in, which we were based in Wisbeach in the Fens, as my dad was a teacher at the local grammar school there. And this list of very derogatory words, sorry if you're a lover of the Fens, don't worry, I'll come full circle in my talk. But this is really how I felt about the area that I was growing up in. And you'll see there wasn't an awful lot of love there for it. The kind of feeling that nothing changed and nothing, the promising of roads that could take you away actually just led to more straight, flat roads, and the rivers were the same. And I was really held by this landscape, maybe more so because both my mother and my father couldn't drive. And so we never really went anywhere unless it was the annual holiday to see grandparents. And so when I was 18, I felt that I was being really clever and escaped the Fens, and I went all the way to Ipswich, which obviously in hindsight is a bit of a joke. But I went to Ipswich and began my nurse training. And then, as life does, it kind of just roller coasted, and I met partner and had a child, and then I met my husband a few years later and settled down, and we had more children, and life went on like that. And I never really stopped to think about writing. I never identified it as the burning desire in me to find the right creative fit. And I began a writing class about 4 years ago, and that's when a teacher very quickly actually identified that this list of words were really useful in writing, and they really showed in my writing because that landscape is so entrenched in my bones. So that story, The Devil's Die, really began, if you like, forming in my head unknowingly about many years ago. My dad used to tell me stories of the historical, in inverted commas, event, the Suffolk legends of Black Shuck, and from that time on I knew I wanted to write a story one day that involved Black Shuck. But about 16 years ago my family moved to Norwich, and that's when I became aware that there had been strangers who lived in Norwich. And that very word is just so intriguing, isn't it? I wanted to know more. And I really struggled to kind of get a sense of who they were and how they lived. When I found that they arrived in 1566 and that the Black Shuck legend based in Suffolk happened in 1577, that's when I really became excited, because I could see that these were so close in historical terms that I could link them and create a story between those years. It also happens to be the lifespan, very conveniently, of a large dog. So that's what I went with. Just to talk a little bit about the strangers, they were a group of people from the Low Countries, which we now know as France and Belgium and Holland. But at that time, Belgium, it still is actually, but more in a more distinct way, was split between these areas of Flanders and Wallonia. So when the strangers came, the Walloons, who were actually from Wallonia, were actually kept themselves really quite separate from the rest of the strangers that came, having quite a different language and ways, culture. So why they came was because they were being invaded by the Spanish Catholics and persecuted, and it was a really serious kind of, they were being murdered, because the strangers that came were Protestant, although different types of Protestant. There were Calvinists and there were Huguenots from France. So Queen Elizabeth I saw an opportunity, if you like. Our worsted trade was depleted in England. We were really suffering at that time because Flanders, which is the Low Countries, were far superior. They didn't call it haberdashery, I don't believe, at that time, but it was this kind of, their techniques were very forward thinking, and their quality of cotton. Cloth was not cotton, sorry, cloth, woolen cloth was very superior to ours at that time. So Queen Elizabeth I saw an opportunity to invite them for safety from their religious persecution, but on the condition that they would share their knowledge for their superior worsted trade with us, and we would benefit from that, which they did. And it was a huge boost to our economy. At first, there were only 30 families invited. They could bring 10 members within each family group, and that could be your apprentices. They don't have to be blood relations. But very soon, that original 300 people grew hugely. So I think it was either a third or a quarter of Norwich very soon became actually the stranger population. And as I say, it really boosted our economy. Now, to research the strangers would have taken many years, because I wouldn't have been able to do it full time, of going into Norwich archives and digging everything I could find. So huge thanks and recognition to the work of Frank Mears, who's a local historian and author, because I came across this book, The Welcome Stranger, that he has spent all those years digging in the archives and looking at wills and looking at the marriage certificates, and actually, from the information he has found, the recorded documents, you can really get a good sense of how they lived and the kind of wealth that they managed to accumulate over time. And the real jewel that I found was that it was very plausible that a stranger could meet and marry a local person. Sorry, this was important to me because I wanted my novel, although it is fictional, to be as believable as possible and to be as historically as accurate as possible. And my protagonist, Joanne, who I'll tell you about in a moment, marries a local girl whose father is a successful kind of wool merchant. So that was brilliant to find out that was a very doable thing to add in. So Black Shuck, the Suffolk Legends, if you're familiar. Sorry, the quality of this photo is a bit very poor and blurry, but actually it's kind of in keeping with this area, if you know it, which is Blythburgh, the Cathedral of the Marshes, which is a huge church, the Holy Trinity Church. And it sits in the marshes. When you go there, you really can imagine how it would have been in days gone by, apart from the main road that kind of goes by it. And it was remote and it was important, and you know, the church stamping their authority on the ground with this massive building. And it was recorded in church pamphlets that on a certain day in 1577, this massive black stinking kind of devil dog stormed into the Holy Trinity Church here at Blythburgh, but also at the St Mary's Church in Bungay. And he killed a few parishioners, and he caused havoc and fear. But as I say, this was recorded in church pamphlets, so we have to be a little bit aware of the kind of propaganda and the power of the church at that time and the influence that it was trying to create. So yes, it may be legend, maybe he didn't really come, although here on the door at the Holy Trinity in Blythburgh, we have got the marks that he left, his huge claw marks. Excuse my book in the corner, I used this as a photo for Instagram, I believe. But it's when you go there, if you really keep the legend in mind, it has got an atmosphere there that makes me believe it could all be very true. And then I don't know if you remember, but in May 2014, the skeleton of a very large dog was discovered in Leiston Abbey, which is actually about 2 or 3 miles from Blythburgh, that church that I just showed you, the Holy Trinity Church. And they did, you know, analyze it, and they decided that there's no way that it could date to that kind of event in 1577, which was disappointing because I felt absolutely sure this had to be Black Shuck's skeleton. But it was all fodder for the thoughts that were developing in my head, and I think maybe Leiston could have benefited from building on that as well. And even if it was proved not to be true, you know, there's people have great imaginations and like that kind of story. So going back to the fact that I started on a writing journey, if you like, for want of a better word, about 4 years ago, and I'd never really written before. I mean, obviously I had informal work, documents and whatnot as a nurse, but creatively not really, since I was a teenager. And so I began a writing course at Wensum Lodge in King Street, which is in Norwich. If you're familiar with it, it backs onto the River Wensum. It's a lovely spot, and these old historic buildings are just perfect. This was our classroom at one point, this upstairs, this is a long horizontal weaver's window. So I'm sitting in there, you know, uneven floorboards, wooden floorboards, this old latticed window, writing about my characters who are set, you know, in this time, because of course this is a building from the 16th century. And it was really inspiring, and the teacher was great. The material that she brought to the classes was spot on, really, for beginning to realise characters and to plot how the book could develop. So all the kind of notes that I've been collecting over the years, and thinking of completely different stories really at first, and it all began to thread together, and I could really organise it. And she also brought, sometimes it was a little uncanny, sometimes Margaret, who was our lecturer, our tutor, sorry, I'm at uni now, so I'm getting confused. She was our teacher. She sometimes brought subjects to the class which I could then incorporate into chapters. It was strange how that happened. So once she gave us this really interesting exercise, an unknown poet, unfortunately, but someone in Turkey, and it had been translated, and he'd written this poem about himself as an old man and coming home to his house and what he'd placed on his table. And at first it was, you know, very actual items like his keys and, you know, maybe his glasses, but then it became very visual and abstract, and it was the, you know, the maths that he couldn't do as a child. and the kind of humiliation that he felt, and the kind of feeling of, you know, ice on your cheeks and then coming in by the fire. And it kind of grew to be all these kind of memories and things that had kind of made his life important to him, or made him who he was. And it was really a beautiful poem. So then the exercise in the class was we did the same. Mine wasn't so beautiful, but it was great, because, as I say, I then got inspired to use that in a particular chapter in the book where Joanne marries Eliza. Eliza, actually, I visualised this is her family home here at Wensum Lodge, and Eliza and Joanne's marriage isn't always happy or good, and so she talks to her mother-in-law once when she's in this kind of dark place and troubled place, and her mother-in-law kind of uses this analogy of having a table and seeing what's important to you and placing it on the table. So that was just brilliant and really kind of pushed the ideas forward for me. Talking of Joanne, I don't believe you would pronounce it Joanne if you were coming from Holland, which he does with his family, the De Hems. They come from Amsterdam. But I worked with him as Joanne, so that's how he is known to me. But his family are very successful. His father's a very successful cloth merchant, and I needed them to be rich. Unfortunately, a part of me really didn't want this to be a rich, you know, good-looking family. It's so cliche and so overdone, but it was important that they were wealthy, because otherwise Joanne wouldn't have had the movement that he needs to have later on in the story, which is really essential to his character. Because what Joanne wants to do more than anything, he's already actually a successful dyer, and he's interested in becoming better at that. But what he really wants is to source indigo. And now indigo at this time wasn't available in Europe. It was incredibly hard to get hold of, because it really was just in India, which wasn't accessible easily. The trade routes hadn't been established in the 16th century. So indigo was regarded as blue gold. It was of such worth and such value. So this is what, more than anything, Joanne is driven to use and to have. So this is indigo, the plant which the chap's working with at the bottom. Its Latin name is Indigofera tinctoria, which is actually part of the sweet pea family, and the leaves aren't that different. So it's a plant-based blue dye, which is very tricky to work with. If anyone ever has worked with indigo, you'll know it's quite hard to release that colour. And here we have an old recipe card from, I think, a French stranger, probably, in 1580. And I hope this blows up okay. This little bit here that I'm circling, again, sorry, the quality's a bit bad, poor. It says, diverse colours, and do esteem it among themselves to be of such excellence that one brother will not teach it to another. So this is really just to show that, like all good businessmen, they were told to come and share all their knowledge to help us. But you keep a little back, don't you, so that you've got something that's you know, special to your particular business. And that's what Joanne wants to do with his indigo. So Norwich at this time was really, on the face of it, not so different as Norwich is now. You've obviously still got the River Wensum snaking through, and we can see parts of our old city wall and kind of work out how that would have looked. But everything in Norwich was within that space. There was nothing on the outside, no buildings on the outside that belonged to Norwich. And what I found really interesting was this castle ditch, which is around the castle here. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but this Castle Meadow, where the buses are now, is where the old castle ditch was. I'll come back to that just in a moment. The other thing that's always fascinated me is Bishop's Bridge, or Bishop Bridge, actually. Shouldn't have the S, I don't believe. Because it's seen so much history, hasn't it? Just this one bridge has kind of Kett's Rebellion, you know, entered this city here. Yes, the Kett's Rebellion had been camping on Mousehold Heath only about 16 years before my story is set. So I find that really fascinating. the history that this bridge has seen and all the people that would have walked over it. And now this view of it, if you go to the left is the city, but if you go to the right, there is a pub, which you may have noticed before, called Lollard's Pit. And that is on the site which they used to burn at the stake, Lollards. And again, this would only have been maybe 10 or 12 years before my story was set. And Lollards were a type of Protestant. And now, of course, we have the strangers just a few years later being invited here as Protestants for safety. So it's such a turbulent time in history. The Lollards were burnt at the stake because at that time Bloody Mary was on the throne. And if you remember, she was a Catholic and very vengeful of the Protestants. So that's got lots of history, which again, I didn't want to bring too much into the book, but it's relevant. It's like us not mentioning something huge that happened in Norwich only 10 years ago that really would still have effects on the city. So I do mention it in the novel. And talking about the castle ditch, this is a lovely mural which is between the Royal Arcade and the Castle Meadow, which I previously mentioned. Excuse me in it, it's another Instagram moment. But I love this mural, and it's a city of stories, so that's just great and quite true, I think, of Norwich. But when you find this mural, well, you'll know that you're standing above what was the castle ditch, because the castle ditch was actually at least 2 floors below that. It really was quite deep. And it was called the Shoebox Charity. I'm not sure if it's changed its name, but if you walk along the castle meadow, go past the back of Waterstones and keep walking, you'll come to a cafe which is run by a charity, and they arrange tours to take you downstairs into the remains of an old weaver's cottage that they found in their basement. It was quite accidental. It used to be Pond's Pond's shoe shop. And apparently when they were, taking it over, not the charity, but someone before that, they'd taken all the kind of shoe boxes out because it was used very much as a storeroom. And they discovered that actually what is here is part of an old weaver's cottage and a clear part of the street that was the ditch. So that's really fascinating and worth doing if you're in Norwich and can book that. So just a little bit further along the River Wensum near Carrow Road, there's 2 boom towers, one on either side of the river. And these used to have a huge chain going between them, which was only lifted to allow the keels, as they were known then, the boats, to either go into the city or out. And it would only be lifted once you'd paid your taxes, and the taxes were huge, and strangers had to pay double on everything, and they had to pay for their own minister and church expenses and support their own poor, which so did the English. The people living within England had to do that. There was obviously no social security, but because you're paying double your taxes as well, because you're kind of out of your own land and you haven't got the support system that you would have had maybe at home. These were really quite heavy penalties to be paying. And the strangers also, if they wanted freedom of the city, they had to buy that by becoming a freeman of Norwich, and that would have been incredibly expensive. So these are the reasons, really, as I said before, that Joanne and his family needed to have money so that Joanne could become a freeman of Norwich. So this was the mayor's home when my story is set, but I had to change his name because I wanted it to be my fictional mayor's home, and this is where Joanne's family, the De Hems, move when they first come from Amsterdam and settle in Norwich. They stay with the mayor and his family for a couple of months. And this is a beautiful building in Colgate in Norwich. And it has got a plaque there on the door which gives the name of the actual mayor, Henry Bacon. And I find it amazing. This is a huge house, very grand, and he was a worsted merchant, which shows just how much money there was to be made if you were successful and with your cloth. And he became sheriff of Norwich in 1548, which was the year before Kett's Rebellion. And he was also the mayor, as I say, the year that the strangers came in 1566. So again, like the bridge that I just mentioned, Bishop Bridge, this house has seen so much history. So many people would have argued and had whispered, you know, secret discussions and touched those walls and crossed the threshold. It was just amazingly inspirational for writing my novel. And I blew that up there because I think on this screen we can see the actual plaque, but when I give this presentation on a big screen in a hall, you can't. So talking about changing names, I kind of looked at, you know, some good East Anglian names, and for Eliza, that's Joanne's wife, I wanted her maiden name to be a proper East Anglian name because her mother's family come from Great Yarmouth. And I liked this Gedge. I don't know if any of you are Gedges, but it was really handy because it really went well with how I was visualising not only Eliza, but one of her brothers in particular. Sometimes awkward with themselves, a little bit clumsy, ungainly in mannerisms, it says here. So a gawky youth could gain it as a nickname and it would eventually become a term of recognition for his offspring and so on. So that was fun, researching those sorts of things. Mentioning Great Yarmouth, this comes into the story quite a lot really, because it's the first place that the strangers arrived when they came across the North Sea, but also because of Eliza's family's connection to it. And it was a really fascinating place to research Great Yarmouth. I was very surprised. I was a bit blinkered in my view of it, thinking it was maybe not as much there as I discovered there actually was. They have got a lot of their walls still there. Some of it has been unbelievably in the 70s allowed to have public toilets and things like that built against it. But if you kind of try and see past that and walk, there are walks that you can go on, you know, to start at one point and to travel right away along it. And you really get a sense of how tiny and compact that thriving fishing port was between that wall and the River Yar. Really would have, these are all the rows, which are sadly not there anymore, but you can see the numbers above arches and get a sense of where the rows were and how tightly packed they were. There's a great museum called the Time and Tide in Great Yarmouth, which has got a replica of a row or part of a row. And that's well worth visiting. But within those rows, everyone lived, everyone worked, drank. You know, can you imagine the smells and the noise and the darkness? And it really excites me to stand there and try and visualize it. So just talking about Yarmouth a little bit more. Oh, and I should mention, sorry, nearly forgot, that this wall was more than just a boundary wall, as often city and town walls were. This was a serious defence wall because the threat from Europe coming across and attacking was very, very real. The Spanish Armada was only a few years after my novel finishes. So the townspeople of Great Yarmouth had to take it in turns to build this wall up, so it was double the thickness, double the height, and they actually had gunners from London sent to Great Yarmouth to teach the local people how to fire the guns that would guard the wall. So again, I find all that very fascinating. So it's just a few of Great Yarmouth's gems, which I had no idea were there. This plaque at the top says that this was a house that Anna Sewell, who was the author of Black Beauty, lived here very early on in her life. Before moving, actually, she moved to Old Catton, I believe, didn't she, after some time. But what a beautiful little house. Look at that little window hiding at the top. Love it. And also on, I believe it's called, my mind's going a bit blank, South Quay in Great Yarmouth. There's a very large merchant's house, which is now owned by the National Trust. And it's well worth visiting that. It's got all the kind of old plaster, really beautifully decorated plaster on the ceilings and the panelled walls, and the kind of initialed huge fireplace, you know, really large fireplace, and the wood surround on it has got the initials of the merchant that had the house built in the 16th century. But I love these little stained glass roundels and panels, because Joanne's mother is a collector of art. She absolutely loves things like this, and these are, as you can see, actually they are Dutch, and I do not know what the inscriptions mean. I wish I did, but I can really imagine her bringing some things like this across the North Sea with her when she came to settle in England, and again, I can incorporate that into the story. So I mentioned Black Shuck, and I knew that I needed to have 2 very large black dogs in my novel. And I knew that they would be Great Danes, but I couldn't refer to them as Great Danes in the novel, because at that time in the 16th century, that name hadn't been derived. They were actually known as chamber dogs. Now, chamber dogs are named from being like the elite of the hunting pack. They were so treasured that they would be allowed to stay in the house, in the chamber. And I know quite a lot about dogs, but I wanted to know specifically if there was anything about Great Danes that could give the reader an idea, apart from the obvious size, that I was really indicating that these were Great Danes. So I spoke to a lady, and this isn't actually a photo of her, but sorry, a lady called Izzy, who runs a dog rescue centre for Great Danes, and she was really, really helpful. She gave me a few indications really of what a fantastic breed they are. And I was quite grateful in a way that I couldn't actually visit in person, because by now it was lockdown, and I had to just do this by phone call. Because if I had seen her, I am quite convinced that I would have come home with the Great Dane, which is, as you can see, not a great idea, because we already have these 4 dogs. So meet my writing crew. They were so patient, just really brilliant, just waiting for me day and night, and you know, every hour that I was writing, they were there in the room with me, just being very, very patient. So thank you to the writing crew, and as my family were too, but it's the dogs that get the photo. So the dogs part of the story is mainly set in Leiston Abbey, which, as I said, is quite near Blythburgh Cathedral, the Holy Trinity. And if you know this area of Suffolk, it's also quite near Dunwich. It's kind of almost like a triangle, the 3 areas. So the dog's story begins in Dunwich, which I'll come to in a moment. But they then settle here in Leiston Abbey with Aggie, who's my 3rd character, and my personal favourite, actually. And Aggie is a friar who's lived through some very terrifying and traumatic event, and this is where he's kind of come to hide away. Now, Greyfriars, as I say, isn't far at all from Leiston Abbey, and is a ruin that you can visit in Dunwich. So it's really worth making a trip that way and kind of visiting all of these in the same day, or over a couple of days if you can. And as I say, Dunwich, I knew it well from living in Ipswich for so many years. These were kind of places that I visited for days out, but I'd never actually gone to these places using my writer's head, if you like. So I needed to visit them at all different times of the year, and really try and walk in my character's footsteps. So different times of the year, different times of the day, you know, different seasons, check that it really would have been a case of looking left and seeing this thing, or it really would have been about 20 steps, or, you know, half a mile. It needed to be as realistic as possible. So that was actually quite hard, because, as I said, lockdown had begun. But when we got a little freedom, I managed to go out and check these places out again, so that I wasn't just relying on memory. talking about walking in your character's footsteps, that's where it got a little bit tricky with Joanne. He's a very colourful character, and he's young and feisty. And the only image I could see in my head for a 16th century guy was the ones that we've seen depicted in quite dark art, normally of that time, quite religious art often. And these high kind of hats and these stiff ruffs. A bit pompous looking, you know, it didn't suit Joanne's character at all. And I was finding it really hard to visualize him, which is when I met Holly Moore, who's a local seamstress who lives in Norwich. She's very young, but very, very talented. And she's got a huge collection of a kind of books about fashion and actual patterns of the time, because this is an example, this corset, of her handiwork. So she actually stitches, everything is hand stitched. She does not use a machine. So she's reproducing the garments that they would have worn in different eras, but making them as they would have made them, which is a huge talent. So it was through looking at her books that she generously allowed me to borrow, that I kind of learned a little bit more about the techniques that they were bringing to us when the strangers came. So there was something called cut work, and this bone lace. So that was beginning to replace the very formal, uncomfortable, I expect, ruffs. So that was exciting because I could bring these sorts of details into the story. But best of all was finding this picture, because although he's very affluent, this guy, incredibly affluent, with his satin and velvet and his mink coat lining, I can visualize Joanne more like this. He looks a little bit more, I can't think of the word, but you know, like someone you might find attractive. I know that's very shallow of me, just clothing, but it was important that I could see him as someone, because he is attractive to women, and that's very much part of his characteristic. This, as I say, is a very affluent dress. So actually in England, I don't know that he could have dressed like this, because they had something called the sumptuary laws, and that restricted the types of cloth you could wear, the colours you could wear, the weaponry you could hold, unless you were a certain level, rank. They didn't have a class system, but it was very much like that. So at the top was obviously royalty and nobility, and somewhere in the middle would have been the merchants, and then of course you had the labourers and the peasants at the bottom. And so Joanne would have been somewhere in that middle. But when he travels to Europe, I think he definitely could have dressed like this. And he does travel to Europe in his search for indigo and other things. So I asked my youngest son if he could draw me a picture of a skeleton, so that I could talk to you about the first draft stage of the process. And I didn't say to him, can you know, any particular expression, but I think it's really funny that he did make this guy look rather terrified, really, because the first draft is a funny stage to have reached. You've basically written your book and you have it all there in front of you, but actually at that stage it's not your book at all. You think, I've done it, you know, and then you realize as you continue with the process that actually that was about a third of what your book will probably become, because it needs meat putting on the bones. This is kind of the bare basic book at this stage. So I began to give it to about 5 selected friends who I knew were really avid readers, broad readers, and who I also really trusted would give me honest feedback. I didn't want people to come back to me with, oh, I really liked it, Jenny, you know, you've done really well. You know, I really wanted them to be nitpicky and to pull out the bits of the story that didn't work or that were weak spots, or just be honest, and so that I could continue working on it and making it better, improving it. So that all began at this stage. And at the same time, I began layering the story, which is exactly as you would imagine and putting that meat on the bones. So adding in what they're doing when they're having a conversation, giving more details to rooms or to the landscape that they're walking in, looking at relevant events in history, not too much because I didn't want to go off at tangents, but if there was something huge going on in history that definitely would have been known about back in England, you know, because the strangers were communicating obviously with the strangers back at home, so they were getting an idea of what was happening with the invasion of their country from the Catholics. So to bring that into the story, it was important. And the painting here is a piece of a very large frieze by Botticelli. It's called Venus and the Three Graces, and I was lucky enough to see it many years ago in the Louvre when I visited there with my husband, and I remember just how amazing it was to see this. The colours are so beautiful, and it's just one of my favourite pieces of artwork. I absolutely love it. And that was painted on the wall of a Villa Lemmy, which is just outside Florence, about 100 years before my novel starts, in the Italian Renaissance. So when Joanne travels to abroad, he also travels to Italy. Something takes him to Florence, and so it's very feasible that he could have actually gone to the Villa Lemmy and seen this on the wall, the frieze, and I could imagine how it might have affected him as well. So as long as it was relevant or within, you know, the story, it gave something to the story and wasn't, you know, totally unnecessary, you just wanted to kind of bung it in there, then you could just start to add some of those kind of interesting facts. The other thing that started, and I should maybe just say that this isn't an order which I'd suggest anyone interested in writing a novel yourself, you know, should maybe follow, but this is how I did it because I hadn't done it before, and in hindsight it was a bit of a kind of back to front or unorganized kind of route to take, but it works, so there. Hey, but I did start then working with a professional editor called Alexander Warsop, and this is actually a photo of one of her hobbies is sailing. So I said, can you give me a photo for my, you know, PowerPoint presentation of choppy water, because that's how I see editing. And I was thinking I wasn't going to enjoy it because it was just going to be rather laborious, but actually it became very quickly the most creatively challenging and most creatively fun part of the whole process. Absolutely loved it. So you know, with Alexander's kind of guidance to improve the flow of the story, you might have taken a couple of chapters out, and she might have said, right, put those chapters back in to the body of the book, but in a different way, you know, in dialogue they can find out what happens in those chapters. And it was incredibly challenging, but yeah, really good fun. So that was going on at the same time, as I say, quite back to front. So you're kind of editing and adding things in at the same time, and, you know, getting feedback from people and adding that in and then editing again. So all a bit chaotic, but I think it worked okay in the end. So at this stage, I hadn't got a title. I was working with some really weak naff working titles, but I got feedback from one of the readers that was quite difficult to hear, but very important. And she said that she couldn't relate to Joanne's character because she didn't feel, what's his purpose, you know, is it just about going around enjoying himself and very kind of hedonistic, and he needs more of a drive. So I had to start thinking about that and taking that really seriously, because he's not supposed to be someone of no substance at all. And so I started researching indigo more. And this picture here shows indigo at its most beautiful, really glistening, beautiful colour. And I discovered that it was much later, after my novel is set, but in the 17th century, indigo was called the devil's dye. Because those trade routes had come across, and now Germany and France were allowing indigo through to reach all of Europe. And as a result, the price had come down and indigo was accessible, and it completely destroyed the trade of woad, which was how we were manufacturing our blue dye before indigo was introduced to the country. So woad is a plant as well, and very easily grown in European and English climate, but you need loads more woad to produce the kind of intensity of the blue that you could get from a small piece of indigo. So yes, the woad industry was crushed practically overnight and regarded indigo as the devil's dye. And I thought, well, what a suitable title for my book. Not only does it relate to the tale of indigo, but it really tells you about Joanne's character quite a lot. He's a complex person, and he is not always good. So that was an exciting discovery. And talking about indigo just a tiny bit, because that is going off at a tangent, but the more I researched it, the more fascinating it was. There are quite a few books about indigo, but I think that deserves a kind of fictional, historical fiction story of its own. If it's not out there, then I think it definitely deserves that. It was actually as big a export from America as the sugar and the cotton in the slave trade, which I was shocked to find out. But that's how immensely people really wanted that product and its value. So because they realized that it could grow in the American climate, south, like I think it was the Carolina was the area that they discovered the slaves were kind of using it, and then of course they profited from that. And only 150 years ago in India, when the British were ruling, the peasants were forced to grow indigo in place of their own rice, supply for their families. And so they actually were starving, and they saw none of the profits, of course, from the indigo that they grew. And it led to a revolt, because they say that without being, not one box of indigo was dispatched to England without being smeared in human blood. And resistance to that tyranny sparkled a 2-year peasant revolt called the Indigo Revolt of 1859. So if you're interested in history, yeah, you might want to look all that up, because it is really interesting. So moving on, I was getting the feedback. We'd edited, we'd really got the book ready now. The story was complete, and what to do with it. At this stage, I was still thinking maybe I'd look in this book, which is kind of regarded as like the Bible of writers and artists. It has all the links and addresses for publishers and agents. But when I was looking, I saw that actually there's a large chapter in this book that's about self-publishing. And for such a respected and recognised book to have that, it kind of made me start to begin to change my mind. I had a little bit of well, a snobby view, if you like, of self-publishing, a naive view, that it was a lesser thing. But actually, if you do it well, if you are conscientious and employ professionals and whatnot, then I think it can be a really valid way of producing books now, as well as the traditional publishing route. So that was very helpful, and really from that point on, I saw that I would self-publish for a few reasons. Also because we were in COVID, and like most people, that had got into my brain and affected my thinking, and I was wondering just what was ahead of us, really. And I knew that it was like a burning desire in me that I needed this novel to be out there and to be left as my kind of mark on the world, if you like. And if you go the traditional publishing route, that can take many years. You might take a long time to get a publisher, but even when you get a publisher, they may sit on that book for a number of years before releasing it. So I'm impatient, and that's another reason why I self-published. And another bonus that I saw as a huge bonus is that then I could create my own cover. So my uncle Martin, who's the brother of my artist father, he's an artist as well, and he really, I love his watercolor paintings very much. So I asked him if he could create a cover. And because he'd spent a few years in India many years ago with his wife, he actually was familiar with indigo factories, which I hadn't realized before we had this conversation. He'd lived nearby an indigo factory, and they regularly saw the workers coming out with their dyed blue hands and the blue water, you know, from the factory running down the streets. Because of course indigo is used very, very much now with jeans and all kinds of things that we dye. It's very much a product. And so he was excited for this project and painted this watercolor indigo leaf using the indigo color for its leaves. And I love it. And I'm very grateful that he did that. And to actually put this cover together, I wouldn't have had a clue, but again, just a fluky encounter, but I came across, for a reason I won't go into now, but I just happened to come across this printer in Norwich, very small, tucked away in Sweetbriar Estate. And they were just so fantastic to work with. And they knew that, you know, if I gave them the artwork, if I gave them the blur, if, you know, we had the barcode, then they could bring it all together and create the cover. So they were a real gem to find. And so I've not got a slide for the next 3 months, because that's approximately how long it took to kind of do all the boring kind of learning how to format your book online and buy the software for that. And oh, it was a bit of a headache, bit of a nightmare. Maybe I should ask my son to do a raging face or something for that one. But it got there, it got done, and then the books arrived. And that's obviously a very, very exciting day. But also, like, what are you going to do with the books then? You know, you're self-publishing, then no one's going to come and take those and distribute them for you. So that's been probably the biggest challenge of all, because I'm not really a tech person, as you can guess from what I was just saying about formatting. And I'm not big on social media, which is really the way that a lot of people get ahead nowadays. So the only way really that I've known to promote and to get my book out there is to actually take it physically to local bookshops, who have been brilliant, and the libraries, very, very supportive. And my book is available in most of the local, within about an hour and a half drive of Norwich. The book is available in the shops, because I have taken them there myself. And some of those books have been kind enough to give me book signings, but of course that's tricky, because if you're an unknown author with an unknown book, then you're not going to get many people coming to book signings. So it's tricky. I think the best thing really for me has been giving these talks to libraries and societies, and people have been really on board with that. Also, the Women's Institute has been brilliant with that. And it's fun for me to do, because I meet so many interesting people doing these talks. And I sell my books at the talks, so that's been a bonus. I still sometimes wonder, as you can see these questions there, I did get into the newspaper, I did get on the radio, but obviously these you have to be doing these things quite regularly to make an impact, I think. And I still think about, well, shall I try and get a publisher? Because actually some publishers will take you on even if you have self-published. So they're all kind of constant thoughts, but life's busy, isn't it? And so, as I say, the book is available now, The Devil's Diary, in Waterstones and in Norwich and Gerald. There's also a Waterstones in Southwold, and all the local independent bookshops on the whole have got them through from Holt to kind of Diss. And yeah, it's great. There's quite an area of East Anglia have been very, very supportive. I also will mention that they are available on Amazon, because some people actually prefer reading ebooks. But also Amazon's a great place. If you do read it and you'd like to leave a review, then please do on Amazon. I believe you don't have to have bought the book there to have left a review, as long as you use Amazon for something. because I don't know about you, but I kind of get a little bit overwhelmed going into a bookshop nowadays. I don't fall for the kind of publishing bluff, on the front, the best book ever and, winner of all these prizes. I want to know what readers have thought of the book. So I often do just check on Amazon to see what the kind of reviews have been left for it before I decide whether or not I'm going to buy the book. And it's, it is incredibly exciting when you see your book on a bookshelf in a shop, maybe next to some really huge authors. This one here is a bit small for you to see, but this is how I discovered Zora Neale Hurston. I don't know if you know her, but she wrote an American Black woman who wrote in the 1930s. And I absolutely love this book. It's called Their Eyes Were Watching God. I think that's it. Sorry, I can't read it upside down. The Eyes Were Watching God. It was uncanny. I can't tell you because I'd be telling you too much about the end of my story and the end of hers. But if you ever do happen to read both of those books, there is an uncanny thing that they both share, and that they are both sitting next to each other on that bookshelf is a bit kind of, shivers up your spine. And someone that I would love to meet, she is deceased now, but when you kind of pick the 5 people you'd like to have around your dinner table, Zora Neale Hurston would be one of mine for sure. And so just to finish then, and to kind of come back full circle, as I said we would, on that list of derogatory words that I put up for living in Wisbech and the Fens, I did self-publish the following year a collection of short stories, which I called Fen Roads. And you can see here that it has got the book cover is the art of my father, Fen Road, which is bizarre when I think about how much I hated it and the darkness, that feeling of that oppression that it gave me. But because I've been on this writing journey and discovered more about the Fens because of looking into the historical kind of nature of drainage of the Fens in the 17th century, because of another novel idea I have, I really started to appreciate it in a different way. I wish that they taught us things like that when we were in school about our own landscape, because it really, I still have got those derogatory words that will never go away. That's embedded, but I can marry it now with this list of much more balanced views, because the people of the Fens and the landscape of the Fens have been incredibly changed and altered and robbed, if you like. And I now can look at it in a much better way. And everyone, the word cathartic is so kind of overused and thrown about with writing, but it is cathartic. There is no other word that I could really use that I can think of. The whole process has been quite healing for me, of something that I didn't even really realize needed to be healed. So lots of reasons to take up creative writing, but certainly, if you want to work something out, it's a great tool. So that really is the end. Oh, I should just briefly say, sorry, if my short stories, they are available on Amazon, but then through Bitten Books, which is a local East Anglian distributor who I now use to distribute my books. And so, some of the local bookshops have Fen Roads as well. It's a wide-ranging collection of short stories. The first few aren't particularly about the Fens, but they kind of take you into the Fens, and then it's really the character of the Fens that I knew that weaves itself through the stories in the book, and they are linked through kind of loss and that feeling of not quite belonging. But at the end of most of the stories, there is that feeling of coming to terms and finding that completion. So that is the end of my talk. As I say, if I was giving this in person, I would have some of my books available at a discounted price, but of course not online here today. And I've really enjoyed this opportunity. So thanks if you've bared with me through from beginning to end. I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.